In less than 2 months' time, one of Spokane's most iconic events will make its annual appearance. The first Sunday of every May, going all the way back to 1977, has been host to Bloomsday. Well done. Touted as the world's largest road race, it actually peaked in 1996 with over 60,000 runners. That's wild. And it became a staple in the culture and identity of this city that we love. Now, Bloomsday has a number of interesting facts and features, and none of them are more famous or maybe more infamous than the dreaded Doomsday Hill, right? As if running 12 kilometers or 7.46 miles for those of us in America was not enough. As you work your way through the 5th mile, you encounter a long, slow climb up a substantial hill. Now, if you've ever participated in Bloomsday, you indeed know this hill, right? It's a signature part of this iconic race, and it's a true test of the most elite endurance. But it's also a sign that you are nearing the finish line, right? Because it's later in the race. It's a sign that you are coming to the end that your body so longs for. And experienced Bloomies know the feeling of cresting the top of that hill, finding relief in knowing that theoretically the worst is behind you. Bloomsday is truly designed to test the most endured, the most experienced runners, and that particular part of the race, nearing the end of the race, is just meant to test your sheer will, your ability to withstand hard things. Also, that knowing that once you get to the top of the hill, you have finally reached the final stretch. Now, last week we began looking at the events of Matthew 26, events that capture the final hours of Jesus' life before his arrest and crucifixion. And Matthew 26 actually introduces us to this new tension that we have yet to experience in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. It's this tension between celebrating the Passover meal with his best friends and the imminent arrest and death that is awaiting Jesus. Last week also marked the beginning of Lent. It's a season that the church has used for 1,700 years to help Christians everywhere contemplate the profound nature of Jesus' death as we prepare to celebrate his resurrection. Now, in some ways, Lent provides space for Christians to sympathize with the disciples, feeling the weight of their waiting, feeling the weight of their anticipation, and eventually feeling the weight of their mourning of the death of Jesus. But Lent also gives us the signal that the celebration is indeed coming, and that the tragic events of Jesus' betrayal, arrest, and death are not the final chapter. That's really good news. Instead, they are the prelude to the greatest act of redemption that history has ever seen. We experience Lent the way that we do because we know the whole story. Right? That's one of the ways we can enter into Lent, knowing that it works out in the end. But the disciples, they did not have that gift, right? They were living it in real time. And so the remaining events captured in the Gospel of Matthew are indeed, admittedly, mostly heavy, okay? They are mostly heavy. And if you don't know that the end is near, and that the end is represented by victory, not defeat, then it would be easy to feel like we're running up this massive hill with no end in sight. Like Doomsday Hill with no end in sight. So here's the posture I would love for us to take and recommend as we study these stories, as we capture these last events over the next 4 or 5 weeks. First, when you feel the weight of these stories, don't run from those feelings, right? Don't just abandon them. Instead, use the weight of these stories to ask God to shape your mind, to shape your heart through them. Secondly, remember that we know in the end Jesus is indeed victorious. That is such good news. And even though the disciples knew, because they were told that that was the case, so they should have believed it, they did not have the events of Jesus' resurrection and ascension to cling to like we do. So when we encounter stories like Judas from last week, who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, or Peter in this week's text, who denies his allegiance to Jesus, I want us to try to avoid going straight to judgment. And instead, do some self-reflection. Use these stories to help reflect about how easy it might be for you and I to fall in these same traps. You see, this exercise, if we handle it with that type of attitude, should help us move more and more towards grace into their failures and help us recognize our need for Jesus, for his mercy, for his grace, because we too are making a final climb. That's what we're doing. Only for us, it's in the Gospel of Matthew. We are nearing the finish line. It is in sight. We have 5 weeks left in a 20-month journey. Can you believe that? That's longer than some of you have been part of this church. It's okay. It happens. So my encouragement is, let's finish strong. And let's use these stories to shape our view of how generous God is, how good he is to us. Now, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the two main characters in our passage today, Jesus and Peter. In our text last week, we saw how the pressure of Jesus' pending arrest impacted so many around him. For Mary, it was this worshipful act of sacrificial love. For Judas, seems like it was a greed-filled betrayal. And today we're going to zoom in on Peter, and we will see him in some of his most conflicted moments as a disciple of Jesus. That's what we're going to see today. Matthew 26:31 says, "Then Jesus told them, 'This very night you will fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered.'" So we pick the story up where we left off last week. Jesus and his disciples celebrating the Passover with a beautiful meal. And Jesus begins to wrap up this meal with a warning to the disciples. He says, "You are going to fall away on account of me." Jesus is telling them, things are about to get worse, and you will abandon me in your distress. It's not really the words that you want to hear at the end of a nice meal with your best friends. Hey, by the way, you're going to abandon me. But in verse 32, Jesus does something kind. He actually offers them a promise, the promise of his return. It says, "But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." That is a clue that they would have likely held on to if they were wise, of like, hey, Jesus is saying these things and they're getting us worried, but he did say, "After I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Jesus is reassuring them of a previous promise that this is indeed the Father's plan and they will be reunited. But Jesus isn't guessing about these events either, right? He's not thinking, I bet this is how it's going to go. He's telling them that this is how it's going to go, and he's doing so through a prophetic word. In verse 31, Jesus delivers the prophecy that the disciples will indeed fall away. And then in verse 32, he delivers another prophecy about his return and their reunion. And sandwiched right between these prophecies from Jesus, Jesus quotes a prophecy recorded in the book of Zechariah. Don't worry, that's probably going to happen to everybody. If it happens to one of us, it's probably going to happen to me too. So do not be afraid, okay? We will handle it with grace. So right between those two verses, Jesus sandwiches this prophecy, this word of encouragement, with a word from a book in the Old Testament, from the book of Zechariah. Verse 7 of chapter 13 says it this way: "Awake, sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, declares the Lord Almighty. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones." So Jesus uses this text, this old prophecy, to do two things. To first, he reinforces the words that he's telling the disciples about their response. He's saying, hey, this was going to be how it was going to be. The words in Zechariah say this. This is how it's supposed to go. And second, he does so to highlight that it has been the plan since before his arrival on earth. Because Jesus indeed came, his primary mission was to redeem humanity through his death and resurrection. And then through that redemption, Jesus establishes a pathway to our future restoration. So Jesus is using these prophetic warnings to comfort his disciples. It may sound hard, it may sound difficult, but these prophetic warnings are actually meant for comfort, helping them understand that what is about to happen is indeed no surprise. It's what's meant to be. And then, of course, what happens next, right after Jesus gives them these comforting prophetic words, it's almost predictable at this point, okay? Jesus gets done delivering these prophecies, these powerful moments, and then Peter does what Peter does. Verse 33, Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." Just imagine Peter's smug face. I mean, seriously, doesn't he ever learn his lesson? Does Peter not know at this point that rebuking Jesus' words is not the play? It's not the move. Don't do that. Peter's folly is actually on full display, and it's interesting how it's presented because it's on display in three distinct parts, okay? Part one, he does not defend his fellow disciples. He says, even if all fall away on account of you, meaning that Peter acknowledges, yes, the other disciples will probably fall away. Jesus, let's admit it, you and I, we get it. They're not as good as me. Part two, but I never will, shows us that Peter is confident in his ability to resist falling away, even though we have seen this movie before, i.e., Peter walking on water. Steps out of the boat, gets a little worried, falls into the water. Peter is saying, sure, Lord, the other guys, yeah, they're going to fall away, but I never will, which is followed up by the third part of his folly where he goes as far as to contradict the words of Jesus. Now, by now, Peter should know, do not contradict the words of Jesus. Remember Matthew 16 where he denies what Jesus is saying about his own death? To which Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan." Yo, you don't want Jesus saying that to you. Now, unfortunately for Peter, it won't take long for him to fall into the very sin that he denies he will commit. And so Jesus tries to give him this softer warning. In verse 34, he says, "Truly I tell you," like, Peter, this is not being facetious. Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And instead of being quick to listen and slow to speak, Peter does what Peter does again, and he doubles down on his stupidity. Verse 35 says, "But Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Did you not just hear what Jesus said, Peter? Stop it. And all the other disciples said the same. They're following Peter's lead. So in just a moment, we're going to actually jump down to verse 69 if you're following along in your Bible, because that's actually where the story concludes. But have no fear, we will come back and cover the events of what happens in these in-between sections in future weeks. And here's why. In these sections, Peter does try really hard to live up to his declaration. So we'll come back and we'll see how these other things play out. Peter plays a small part in some of them. But what I want to recognize as we move forward is that he does try. He really tries. But ultimately, as we know, Jesus' words are always true. They're always true, which means Peter is in for a rough evening. So jumping down to Matthew 26, verse 69, it says, now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard. This is after Jesus has been arrested. We'll come back to that in future weeks. And it says, a servant girl came to him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. You see, as we jump ahead to the end of the chapter, we have this picture of Peter actually stalking Jesus after his arrest. I know there's some gaps in there, but basically what happens is Jesus is arrested, and actually all of the disciples, they flee, they scatter. But Peter actually does a turnaround. He says, I got to see what's going on. So he begins to follow Jesus at a distance. And so Jesus is standing before the high priest and the rest of the religious leaders. And Peter's actually kind of hiding in the distance, okay? And he's watching these events take place. So he is there. Now, that is kudos to Peter, because the rest of the disciples are indeed long gone. They're scattered. They're hiding. But Peter initially fled the religious mob that was attacking Jesus, arresting Jesus, but now he's shifted his heart and he started to come back to Jesus, at least for a moment. Now, the question is, did he come back out of curiosity? Did he come back to rescue Jesus? Did he come back out of guilt? The truth is, we don't know, but we do know that Peter is in what I would consider to be dangerous proximity to Jesus in this moment. So, while he's sitting in the courtyard, in the house of the high priest, this servant girl approaches him and says, hey, you were with Jesus, right? To which Peter responds, I don't know what you're talking about. Denial number one. Then in verse 71, it says, then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. Now, in this section, in verse 71 in particular, it is helpful to point out what Matthew's actually doing, because Matthew has selected each word very carefully to represent the story. You see, after Peter's first denial, it says that Peter went out. He went out to the gateway. Words that pair Peter's physical movement with what Matthew was trying to paint as the posture of Peter's heart, slowly moving away from Jesus. It's actually very beautiful what Matthew's doing here. Then a small group of people led by a servant girl, which is Matthew's way of highlighting that she represents very little actual threat to Peter, right? The servant girl would have been the lowest status in society, and she's the one who comes up and just asks, hey, weren't you with Jesus? This is not the high priest. This is not his guard. It's not even any of the religious leaders. It's a servant girl. Yet Peter is still so afraid of these people that he denies knowing Jesus again. Only this time he does so with an oath, it says. Again, another piece of thoughtful language, because Jesus actually taught on this during the Sermon on the Mount, on the dangers of using oaths to swear against heaven and God. I'm going to read the passage to you from Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus addresses this very thing. Verse 33 says, again, you have heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So Matthew is showing his readers that in Peter's second denial, which happened with an oath, he's not only breaking the declaration, this bold declaration that he gave to Jesus, I will never do that. And moving away from Jesus, he's not only doing it, but he's doing it with a high level of disregard for the teachings of Jesus. See, I think this is perfect timing because this is where you really need to be locked in. It's alerting you, like lock in. Because Peter's actually shrinking very quickly. He's shrinking away from his bold declaration. Then in verse 73, it says Peter encountered a third group of accusers. Here's what it says. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately, a rooster crowed. So this time, Peter's actually questioned because of his accent. Peter's from Galilee, okay? This is where it matters. And apparently, that accent is distinct, unique, and so it actually gives him away in this moment. And as a result of this accusation, Peter he sinks deeper into his denial. The third denial comes in the midst of a curse-laden oath. I don't know the man. Here's the reason for Peter's accent being a big deal. Peter's from Galilee, and Jesus is from Galilee. Jesus is the most famous person from Galilee by a mile. It's not even close, which means it would have been impossible unless Peter was living literally under a rock for him to not know who Jesus is. D.S. O'Donnell says it this way. It would be like saying you're from Chicago and that you have never heard of Oprah or Al Capone or Michael Jordan or Mike Ditka. That cultural reference should bring us a little closer to the understanding of what in the world is Peter doing? No way. So seemingly, Peter is making a fool of himself, denying even knowing Jesus, let alone his identity as a disciple. Which makes the reality of his downward spiral even more clear and more real, spiraling further and ever towards the sorrowful realization that we see in verse 75. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. You see, in a matter of hours, Peter goes from heroic defender of Jesus, rebuking the slightest hint that he was capable of betraying Jesus, to Jesus denier, cowering away from the least threatening people in all of society, like the servant girl on the outskirts of the courtyard. You see, it's far too easy for me to look at Peter's story and wonder, what was he thinking? Like just off the cuff, what was he thinking? Sort of filtering these thoughts and these questions through what I know to be a bit of a judgmental lens that I can carry. You see, I admit, and I can be very critical, first and foremost, of myself, but I can be ashamedly critical of others. And that's the result of my sinful nature. Thankfully, God is graciously working that out of me. But stories like these, stories like Peter's, tend to draw those to the surface. Right? Maybe you felt a little bit of that in your own soul as you thought about, what in the world is Peter doing? Why does he keep falling into these same traps? Why does he keep overestimating his own willpower? Why does he keep contradicting the words of Jesus? And then I remember all of the same traps that I fall into. Despite my devotion to Jesus, despite my best intentions, I, like Peter, fall short far too often. Far too often. So this story is actually a good reminder of the work I need to do to address what I would consider the plank in my own eye before I become overly considerate of the speck in my neighbor Peter's eye. That's lesson number 1. Mark it. Here's lesson number 2. As much as I can sit on my high horse and judge Peter for his folly and wonder in my own judgmental mind, why does he do that? I am also humbled and deeply thankful for the example that Peter is in illustrating for us how broken and deceitful our human nature can really be. And when I consider the source of this account, I realize that Peter is actually very devoted to Jesus, and his devotion is truly admirable, and here is why I think that. You see, this story is built with eyewitness account, like all the Gospels are. And I got to thinking about and reading about who would be the person providing this eyewitness account of these tragic denial events in Peter's life. It's not actually Matthew, because like the rest of the disciples, he's long gone. Which means that the most reputable and most likely source of these events is Peter himself. Yeah, Peter. Despite the embarrassment that led to him weeping bitterly, as it says, he understood the assignment. He understood what it would take to help people and Christians like us thousands of years later understand what is happening and how important these moments are. Showing others the sad reality, but true reality of our broken and fragile human nature. So that hopefully we would avoid the same very fate. You see, Peter's flaws are on full display in this story, and we have him to thank for this incredible reminder of our own capacity to deny Jesus. So here's the question I want to set before all of us in this moment. I'm going to have the band come back up in just a moment. We're going to have some thoughtful, reflective prayer on this. But here's the question I want to set before us to consider today and throughout this week, if you can design some prayer time. How is God encouraging you through Peter's story of failure? I'll say it again. How is God encouraging you through Peter's story of failure? Is it Jesus' gentle words to the person who will deny him? Because Jesus is actually very gentle with Peter. Or maybe it's the incredible grace that Jesus shows to Peter in the face of his own challenges. You see, Jesus is actually the one that's about to endure the worst. But he doesn't take that out on Peter. He's actually very gracious with him. And just in case, or maybe you've forgotten, Peter will actually go on to play a very critical role in the early church. He will actually face persecution for this role. He will eventually reconcile the events of this day. So even Peter's denial is redeemable because of Jesus. It's redeemed through future events. So maybe you're encouraged by the reality that even though Peter doubts, and despite all of that doubt and all of that denial, even Peter is redeemed by the love and grace of Jesus. You see, I think we desperately need to hear Peter's story so that we can be encouraged in our own moments of weakness, in our own moments of denial, in our own moments of failure. And so I actually want to leave us with this passage from 2 Corinthians 12 that talks about our weaknesses actually being a strength in Christ. Because like Peter, this needed to happen. This was meant to happen. And even though it was very tragic for him, it was part of the plan. Peter was never going to be able to not do what he said he wouldn't do. He was always going to be gone from Jesus because that is what we see in Scripture. God knew before Peter ever existed that in this moment he would indeed deny Jesus. And yet the entire time he didn't hold it against him. In fact, he used this to help Peter, as we will see in future passages, in future studies. If you go and read the book of Acts, Peter was very influential and almost essential to the early church. And so we know that even in our moments of weakness, we are not irredeemable. But this passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10, leaves us with some hope that even in the midst of our weakness, we are right where we are meant to be. This is what it says, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Then Paul says, 'Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" Paul is declaring that despite his inability to overcome his own weaknesses, Christ is made strong in the midst of those weaknesses. So again, I come back to the question, how is God encouraging you through Peter's story? Let's take a minute and just prayerfully reflect on that.